A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped, his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade wind soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn-bright lawn, but he names the sky his own. But a cage bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. Good morning. That is a poem by Maya Angelou, Caged Bird. And I share it with you today as we enter into an important and perhaps sobering conversation in the wake of a week that has highlighted for some of us the extent of police brutality against Black bodies and the rate of death for Black Americans as compared to the rest of America during the pandemic of COVID-19. We have come together, members of our community, professionals from different walks and different journeys, to talk about Black health under threat. Joining me today is Akia Reed, health advocate and author of Be Free, Be You, Dr. Yuel Boyce, naturopathic doctor and owner of Boyce Natural Health, and ChrisTina ObeySumner, owner of Epiphanies of Equity, LLC. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You know, I will admit to you that I struggled and had a bit of a restless night, wondering where do we even begin today? Not only as professionals in our community, but also coming together as Black Americans to speak quite authentically. I guess I'll start with just a check-in. How are you?
I think I'm a mixed bag right now of emotions. I think there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of frustration, and I think disappointment at the root of all of that, because I don't like that we're still here at this same place.
Yes, yes. And Akia, you know, I, as a wonderful respite over some cups of tea, I was able to read your book this past weekend, Be Free, Be You. And you had already been on a journey of working to promote Black health and to destigmatize mental health issues among the Black community. In this particular moment, does your work seem especially poignant?
That's a really good question, and yes, it does. But as much of the work that I've done, you know, in the last 4 years that I started this whole process, I feel like in many instances, what is going on in our country right now, I'm just beginning. And I actually thought through that yesterday. I'm like, wow, I've done so many things, but yet I feel like there's so much more to do.
Yes. Yes. Christiana, how about you?
Complicated, because I think that there is a piece of this where there's some positivity. Like I'm a social equity consultant. So I've been talking about anti-racism and disability justice, and particularly just like, how do we, like, as people, stop harming, killing, um, oppressing each other based on these sort of constructs, like the truth of these constructs being that they're constructs, reality of these constructs being that they're killing people. And I think that a lot of this, this insurrection is not because of just one thing. It's the last 400 to 600 years, depending on who you ask, of things. And so I've seen more people engage with me and ask about, well, what can I, what is going on? And I have also seen, both as an organizer and as a consultant and just as a person in community, that there's a lot of threats to progress, a lot. And everything from burnout to being overwhelmed to infusion of whiteness culture, and like trying to weaponize time and to have folks fall for okie dokes and devil's bargains. I've seen folks put out statements declaring solidarity that where the statements were being forced to Black folks in particular to write, so it's not even reflective of the organization. I've seen statements from organizations that say nothing. They don't have any accountability. They don't have any action. They don't have any strategy. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, like, so there's a part of it. It's like, this is not a trend. This is life. This is our life. This is our history. And I think that with the pandemic, I already was frustrated that, people will, I don't know, be able to talk this talk. And then when it's time for action, folks are like, oh no, what do we do? And I feel like now it's like, oh, I know, we'll write a statement and yes, that'll show them. And so I just feel like for me, it's just like, I'm in this moment where we're in the middle of an uprising. My mom was in a moment with the Rodney King riots where she was in the middle of an uprising. My grandma, as a Black Panther, was in a moment where she was in the middle of an uprising. My great grandma was in a space during the turn of the 20th century where she was in an uprising as we went into the Great New Year. And it's just kind of like, is this ever going to end?
It's so interesting. One of the rare gifts of being in quarantine for so long is that we've been on a thread with all of these generations of my family. And I won't bore you, but I'm sure you can imagine the ordeal of getting my great-great on WhatsApp. But it did turn out to be a wonderful gift. And it's been interesting listening to their stories about how triggering this is. For exactly the reasons you just mentioned, Christiana, in that they're saying, I was going through this growing up in Jim Crow South. I was going through this and so they're feeling as though they're going through those journeys and those fights all over again. But I want to go back because you use some language that if somebody is watching right now, that they don't know what that means, potentially. And so I'd like you to break down some of these words. What does it mean, a construct? What is a construct of race?
A construct essentially is when a society comes together, or a portion of a society comes together, and they put meaning to a thing, and they all agree that that's what that meaning is. Or enough people with enough power say, this is what the meaning is going to be, and then other people will either fight it or they'll go with it. And race is one of those things. When you think about, another way to think about this is like, professionalism. So when I say that word, what comes up in your head? A lot of different sort of things. I bet you also, especially if someone is not Black, when I say the word professionalism, someone who looks like me is not the archetype or the vision that comes in their head. And that's the problem. Because we have had this construct of race for so long that the archetype of what comes up when you hear Black person is a whole bunch of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with a lot of us, if not most of us, if not all of us. And so there's a situation, things like George Floyd, right? Which is this large, you think about it, oh, large Black man. And then what do you start to think of? I don't even have to say it because I'm pretty sure it's already going through your head. And so, my background is in social psych. This is where it's coming from. So, if you are a person and you talk about this unconscious bias, right? Unconscious bias leads to action, and that action leads to what they would call a microaggression. This is this aggression, is this violence. And so that aggression of Derek Chauvin was likely this white man as a police officer saying, construct of large Black man, dangerous, criminal, I need to put my knee on his neck for 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think what's hard about this is that this is not new. This is the reason, construct and how construct is infused and drives behavior in our society. I feel like is one of the interwoven threads of things like the, social determinants of health disparity, and why Black and brown folks are so disproportionately impacted, not because of anything necessarily that they did, because of things like environmental racism and medical racism, and a lack of intersectionality. As a Black disabled person, I feel like there's a lot of this conversation that, we're not even talking about, that the family had to go and get an independent autopsy report because there's this propensity for people to want to find some sort of medical or pre-existing condition to explain away the murder that at the hands of police. Even now, they're trying to say that, oh, well, did you know that George Floyd had tested positive for COVID and on April 4th and he died? Well, he's murdered May 25th. So they're still looking. And so it's like, if they're doing that post-mortem, then imagine what they do to Black disabled people during their life.
And I want to come back to that. Thank you for bringing that up. But yes. Dr. Boyce, on an episode a few weeks ago, it came out. So here's Dr. Boyce. I'm pretty sure, I remember you saying you're a 6'7" Black man.
Yes.
So,
yes.
When you hear that there is a construct around, I'm a tall Black man, and there's an entire idea of who I am, what I represent in society, the danger that I pose. What is that experience of growing up as a young Black boy and then maturing into an adult Black man? Talk to us about that experience.
It's stress. I mean, it's stress. It's quite stressful. I think because of my height, and just and even the tone of my skin, always having to negotiate more than I would like to, how I move through certain spaces. And I'm always aware of how I'm received, the tone of my voice, inflections, movements. I'm tall, I'm muscular built, so I'm always conscious of that. And I think it's a stress that, unfortunately, a Caucasian man of similar height and age wouldn't necessarily have to negotiate or deal with. So stress.
Yes. And as a health professional, I remember in the pre-show, you were speaking about how both you're having to negotiate your own mental health through this time, and your patients who are coming in, talking to you about current events. What has that experience been like?
It's been rather interesting, but it's interesting, but not really. As Christiana said, and Akia said, it's like this isn't anything new. We've been dealing with this, for years, and so racism as a construct, it parlays into healthcare, medical racism. So what I have experienced, lots of panic, lots of anxiety, abnormal increases in blood pressure, and so oftentimes, a Caucasian physician or a physician who doesn't understand racism as a construct, or any healthcare provider may not understand that, sustained, the compounded stress of racism, of existing in this country as a person of color, the effects that it can have on hypertension, eating habits, which then parlay into, chronic hypertension, diabetes, obesity. So yeah, it isn't anything new. So I'm not surprised. And it's very frustrating, to be frank.
Mm. Tell us
Because
more about that.
Because we want to get into this notion of blaming people. Okay, well, or even some members of the Trump administration, when it was reported that, people of color, particularly African Americans, were dying at a rate of 3.5 times greater than their Caucasian counterparts due to COVID-19. Okay, so then members of the Trump administration were quick to victim blame and say, okay, well, they're dying because of this pre-existing conditions or these comorbidities. Well, at what point was there ever a mention of, okay, possibly the rate of death is higher because there's a lack of access to diagnostic testing and also a lack of access to treatment? That was never part of the discussion. And so it's almost as though, as Christiana and Akia said before, like the deck is stacked against us. And ultimately, I would love for racism as a construct and how, it permeates throughout all aspects of society, all sectors, be part of this conversation, as we're protesting against police brutality. I would love for there to be, it's part of discourse, but let's talk about how medical racism as a construct kills far more people of color than police brutality. And not taking away, because I'm absolutely livid off of what's happened to Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud, Philando Castile, livid. And I'm also livid at this almost, it's acceptable, accepted, treatment of people of color within healthcare system in this country, healthcare systems, public and private.
Public and private, yes.
Yeah.
And tell the story you were sharing recently about the young woman who was seeking medical care for her menses and what had happened in her experience.
Yes, it's another testament. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Another testament of medical racism. A colleague of mine who practices in Atlanta, also practices telemedicine. There was a incident where a young African-American woman had complained of a month-long black vaginal discharge. And essentially, the healthcare provider who took the intake just assumed, okay, overweight African-American woman, she's just suffering from, a heavy menses. But again, it had not been for my colleague who was a black physician in Atlanta, if he never thought to look at the note and say, this is odd, a black vaginal discharge for a month? That's abnormal. And it's not rocket science, do you know what I mean? And so what happened, he called her in for a vaginal exam, and it turned out that she had a tampon stuck inside of her vagina. And then there was some who wanted to blame the victim, but okay, would you do that to a Caucasian person? As a healthcare provider, onus is upon us to say, okay, a black vaginal discharge for a month is abnormal. Come in for a vaginal exam. This young woman could have died from toxic shock syndrome due to medical negligence. And this happens time and time again. Not necessarily this case, but many other cases, similar cases.
Yes.
Can I affirm that?
Sienna?
Can I just affirm that? And also, in my experience of doing disability justice work, especially with Black folks, is because of these experiences, this is also something I grew up with, just don't go to the hospital, just don't go. And I've been developmentally disabled and autistic, but I started developing a physical disability or mobility. I don't know what it is yet. And that's the whole point, is I went from being an able-bodied person, going to the gym, doing kettlebells, going on hikes, being able to, you know, do all my ADLs, cook for myself, stuff like that, to like just falling out on the floor if I stand for more than 20 minutes. It's been 5 years. And, you know, it's definitely orthostatics, something neurological. You know, it shouldn't matter, but I've educated person, went out and got medical journals, all these different sort of things. And, you know, there was the point I think I decided, you know what, there's no point in going back to the hospital, was when I had an increased heart rate, which is part of it. And I went to Northwest. And everything was happening and I was trying to be calm because I couldn't breathe and my heart was racing. And this doctor came in and was like, "Oh, and are you taking meth?" And I'm like, and so there's so many times where I've had folks in my family that by the time someone in the family is like, "Okay, well, screw it, we're going to call 911, it's too late. And on top of that, and once they get to the ER, then we hear in a week or so that they're dead. My grandma died of medical racism. My Uncle Wayne died of medical racism. And I say their names because they die.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why people don't go to the hospital. And my family is primarily in the South Jersey, Philadelphia area. And there's a lot of intersection between environmental racism, people having asthma because they put them in the pathway of particulates, and then a respiratory pandemic comes through after they've been exposed to all of this crap, and then they want to say, "Oh, we'll just stop smoking." Well, stop putting highways over our house. And so it's hard because there's, you know, to the original question about what's happening now in health, there's the mental health and the stress of like, when I go and try to have these conversations, say, now, you know, sometimes I'll go to like racial liberation and Black liberation spaces. "Hey, let's talk about this." "Oh, we're not talking about disability right now. We're not talking about like what it means to go and have a chronic illness and try to get, you know, what it means when a employer says, "Oh, go get a doctor's note for that." And you're like, and then I'll go to the disability space and I'll say, "Well, we're only talking about disability, but we're not going to bring in the conversation of race because that's divisive." And so what happens is that, you know, I'm here to admit it because I feel like this is one of those things, right? I just gave up going to the hospital. And unfortunately, my spouse has become my caregiver, and it sucks and it shouldn't happen. And I'm not the only one. So it's like, it's experiences like what you shared, Dr. Boyce, where it's like, after a while, you give up. My mom is agoraphobic and hasn't left her house in like 15 years because she's afraid. It's the race-based traumatic stress has stopped her from leaving the house, and that's also had health impacts. So it's one of those things where, yeah, I just want to affirm what you say, because I feel like, especially in disability justice spaces, like, this is what I see is like BIPOC and especially Black folks like suffering in silence of like, I'm not allowed to be disabled. I'm not allowed to be vulnerable. I'm not allowed to have pain. I had a doctor tell me, "Oh, well, maybe it's a mind-body thing."
Yes.
You know, like,
Yeah.
And it's like, but I've been in therapy for like 10 years. What, do you think this is new? Like, this gaslight me and send me off?
Yeah.
Can we say that I see everybody nodding their head. Can we all relate to this language that Christiana used of getting to a point where you feel like, I'll just give up in some sort of arena, whether it's the combination or the intersectionality around race and mental health, race and physical health or disability, race and some of your career pursuits, this language around giving up, you know, I was having light bulbs going off for me. Can anybody else relate to that feeling? Akia?
Actually, my own journey is what led me to advocacy. Because 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety and depression. Now, mind you, I had been in therapy 3 years before that. And there was no diagnosis. You know, it was just, you know, some Black woman in there talking about, you know, her problems and things that happened to me, you know, as a kid. But for me, what I decided to do, as opposed to giving up, is I decided to go back into my community and help my people, because I understand that the mental health conversation, I can so assist what, you know, Christiana and Dr. Boyce said, is that, you know, Christiana said, I'm afraid to go to the hospital. Well, when we talk about mental health, the last thing that a Black person wants to do is go to a therapist and admit that they are having issues that are making them incapable of living life, because society already thinks that we are incapable. Society already thinks that we are threats or that we are less than. So what I have found when I talk to other people that look like all of us, they will talk to me before they will go and talk to a therapist, because they don't want to be marginalized, or they will just hold it all in. And so in many ways, I feel like I am trying to be that, you know, that person in the middle that tells them that it's okay to go and talk to somebody. It's okay to acknowledge that you have these things. And quite frankly, most of what happened to our ancestors, generations before us, I believe is what has caused us to be in this position from a mental health standpoint anyways. So we didn't just get here on our own. You know, we definitely had assistance in getting to this place where we are in the position we are as a community of people.
Yes. Dr. Boyce, was there something you wanted to say there? I saw you.
I just wanted to affirm both what everyone has shared. And I, in response to your question of have I felt like giving up? And at times, for moments or a couple of days, you know, the compounded stress of, you know, navigating personally through this racist, pervasive racist construct. But then I also think I have to, something happens where I'm inspired yet once again to advocate for myself as well as for people who look like me. And, you know, Christiana and Akia, I think at times as tired as we, or fed up as we may feel, I think onus is upon us, because we do have vocabulary, the savoir-faire to, you know, to advocate for ourselves more so than many of our brothers and sisters. I think onus is upon us to, you know, somehow, I don't know, work through it, not just for us, but for others, because, you know, I've met patients who really don't even, you have to even change the lexicon that's used. It's not diabetes. Do you have sugar? It's not blood pressure. It's do you have pressure? And so people like us, we can bridge that gap, and it's needed, because it's like, look at this. It's just like, there's no reason why you know, I mean, how many people have died here, I think, recently? I mean, it's like 108,000 people have died due to COVID. You know, we're only 20, not even 20% of this country, but like so of that, you know, what I think around, what is it? I think maybe 30,000 people of color have passed. It's like, it makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense. And when we think about access to care, it's like, as I stated earlier, the deck is already stacked against us. So those of us who have the wherewithal and the capacity to advocate for ourselves and others, somehow we have to push through. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. But I know because of language that I may use, not just having being a physician licensed, but it's just the posturing in and of itself makes a huge difference. You know, I'm not leaving here till I receive, you know, a thorough exam. You know, how dare someone say to you, Christiana, oh, meth? Like, are you like?
Yeah. And I should clarify, like, when I say give up, I mean give up in like the Western medical model system.
Okay.
So like,
Yeah.
you know, like I see a therapist right now and I talk to them and I think, you know, there's a lot of barriers, right? I have Medicare. Medicare tells me who to see. It's usually not a Black person. That causes a barrier. So then, you know, it's at a point where it's like, I'm not going to go back to, you know, it's, I mean, here's another thing too, like before COVID, I was trying to save money for medical tourism. I was like, well, should I go to Brazil or Nigeria or South Korea or somewhere, or Atlanta or somewhere that's like not here, where someone's going to see me, like you said, someone who's actually just going to look at the tests and say, oh, this doesn't make sense. Not like, oh, look at this like Black person who looks all young and healthy. There's something, you know, something wrong with it. But but that's also why I do what I do, is because I think, especially in terms of mental health, like, yeah, we have very similar like origin stories in that, you know, like I said, the first thing is being autistic with psychiatric disabilities. I thought I was going to be a psychologist, and I went through 10 years of wanting to be a psychologist, and I was in the middle of the LMHC master's program, right about to go into clinicals, and I was just like, no, because I didn't see a pathway to be able to help folks in a way that is not going to continue and perpetuate the systems of oppression. And I think working in social work while going into the LMHC program, it led me to like more like systems focus of like, well, then what are the alternative routes that are not the majoritarian?
Right. Well, and I think Lindsay, oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I want to know if I'm watching right now and I am listening and I'm a white viewer and I'm going, well, you know, there's 4 Black Americans here, all, you know, well-educated, and, you know, this is just their unique stories. Have you had that experience, or add to that the experience of being, we'll use the word tokenized, but I want to break that down, the idea of, well, you know, I can talk to you about this, Lindsay, because you're not like other Black people, right?
Yes, 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 yes. I talk about this a lot, where I have experienced being the exception. I am the acceptable Negro, basically, you know, because of the way that
Oh, I'm gonna let Dr. Boyce or Christiana jump in, and then we'll come back to Ikea when she's back live.
Yeah, that's a story of my life. And I think in many ways, my family's from the Caribbean. And so this notion of setting yourself apart was something that was kind of ingrained in me as a child. My mom's Jamaican, my father's from Barbados. And it's something I never understood, because I just learning history, wait a minute, even as a, you know, Afro-Caribbean American, you know, how can I disassociate myself from the majority of Black folks in this country when I'm a beneficiary of rights that they have fought for? You know, so and we're all in this together, regardless of my, you know, where I stand on this socioeconomic paradigm. I'm still a Black man, you know, working through this racial construct that is racist construct that is America. And so while there may be differences, class, education, even whatever, I'm still a Black man, yeah, and who deals with racism every day. However, albeit having a different experience, it's still racism.
Yes, yes. Christiana?
It's another complicated answer. And I think it's because I'm autistic and
complicated.
What that means in terms of like growing up autistic. There's a lot of people who tell your parents that you have to do things in a certain way and go to these programs and be in these special classes and take, you know, do these special little things because you're not developing in the right way, or you're not communicating properly, or your play is not in the same little way, and whatever. So I pretty much very, very quickly realized, I didn't have the term construct, but I knew that there was an area of humanity and society where people are supposed to perform in a certain way. And that performance doesn't mean that that's who you are, it's a performance. And then when you go into a safe space, then you're able to be yourself. For me, that's being nonverbal, that's stimming, that's all this different sorts of stuff. But I also noticed that in addition to race, because if I were to be able to go into, like, say, the classes for other developmentally disabled children, the white children would stim in class, and it's like, oh, this is part of it. And then I would stim in class, and it's go to detention. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, now I have to act a certain way in order for me to be a certain way. And so I think what's also really difficult about it is that for me, it's always been this, like, for me, it's always been like a puzzle. It's like like navigating a mystery of, like, oh, you want me to perform this way. If I perform this way, what would happen? To me, it's like, it's very like sociological. Like, there's always like feeling around with what those things are. But it's also, I think the intersection of code switching and masking is so freaking stressful all the time. And so I feel like I have sort of felt the tension of, like, folks saying, oh, wow, you're so articulate, and which is a huge trigger. And especially because, like I said, I prefer to be nonverbal. And so in forcing me to speak and speak in a certain way, then it's like this thing of, like, oh, great, the conditioning is working. And then on the other hand, within my community, they're like, oh, you just think you're so haughty because you're talking this way. And so there's like this disconnect and this tension of, like, do I just be myself, which in my past, which I won't get too much into, but it led to about 6 to 7 years of involuntary institutionalization or some sort of programming to force me to be this person. And so I tell folks in Seattle all the time, because I'll be here for 10 years next month, is like, if you knew me before I got here, you wouldn't recognize me, because I was a whole different person. The person this is a person that those institutions said, we're not going to let you out of this institution until you perform a certain way. And that way of performing is what people see as, like, the good Black person. So I'm always kind of in this tension and anxiety of, like, I know this is wrong and it's being forced upon me because I literally went through that process. And also, this is the survival. And so how do I sort of, like you all were saying, be in that in-between where I have both a knowledge and a wisdom of the inequitable structures that are happening because I've been in it. And even though I may be younger, I feel like the experiences that I had in my short 30.5 years is 33 years, 34 years, whatever, is there's a lot that I think in that question that is more of a visceral response that I can't really articulate as well or share as well than a theoretical or abstract or reflective one. And I feel like I'm still actively in it every day. So it's complicated.
Well, but we do know that you are young. Only a young person is like, I'm not sure how old I am.
Right.
But,
whatever, somewhere in the mid 30s, early to mid 30s.
There's a point where you're pretty, you know how old you are. You haven't reached it yet. Tell me, in that that performance, that mask wearing, the ways that we have to be performative to survive a lot of the times, whether that is surviving when just trying to walk down the street or when I'm out, for me, with my children playing, and the ways that we have to perform at work or in social gatherings. Akia, what was it that you said when we were talking about the experience now of friends of ours in the white community who are reaching out, and they're now saying, I didn't know, I'm waking up, which is its own interesting thing to say, I didn't know, or is it that you didn't want to see, right? You had said such a powerful thing about when these friends are reaching out in the impulse to want to show love and care, but then they're asking, what do I do? What should I do? What did you say about hanging on the tree?
Wow, that's a really graphic one. Basically, I feel like anytime a white person asks me that, it's like I'm hanging from a tree and you're standing down at the bottom of the tree, looking up at me, asking me how to get me down.
Mm.
And there is a part of me through this whole thing that had gotten so angry about, why am I still carrying the burden of educating people that are either willfully ignorant or they're so consumed with their white privilege that they don't understand that it's a privilege to not have to know about this. Mm-hmm. It's a privilege to not have to talk about this. The thing with the biggest question that I've been getting is, because I have two children that are, 12 and 9. They're like, how are you talking to your kids about this? Or how can I talk to my kids about this? And, that in itself, what I explain to them is that in itself is a privilege. You understand that, right? That you get to pick and choose when and if you talk to your kids about it. You get to cherry pick the type of information that you give them. Black people don't get that same privilege. We are talking to our kids when they're 5 years old, and it starts little conversations about being called the N-word all the way up until they're older when we are talking to them about this is what you do if you're stopped by a cop. And it just doesn't stop. So it's not a question of whether or not, our kids are going to experience it. They are. It's not if, it's definitely when at some point in their life. And so it's, but I've been, again, like I said in the beginning, a mixed bag, because I feel like, just like Dr. Boyce said, that we have this responsibility in a way because we do have the intelligence and the articulation to be able to educate. And so I look at me having this platform of being an advocate for mental health. I've got to speak on these issues that are affecting the mental health of Black people. And I can't hold my tongue. That I don't even have that privilege, because people need to know, and I need to let my voice be heard and not be quiet.
Yes. Yes. I want to read something to you. This is from the representatives from Black Lives Matter Seattle, and they shared, different members from Black Lives Matter shared yesterday in a Facebook Live. And I want to share this quote. We live in a country that has lost more than 100,000 people to COVID-19. This virus has ravaged our communities in a way that largely mirrors the existing inequities and structural racism inherent in our healthcare systems. We refuse to encourage our community members to needlessly risk their lives and their health during this time when other avenues of action are available. We reserve the right to take to the streets in the future, but we encourage those who are most directly impacted by this fight to put your safety and health before anything else. This is a marathon, not a sprint. The victory is hollow if we're at the finish line alone. Dr. Boyce, what's your response to that?
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm currently in New York, and here, you've all seen what's been happening here, a large mass protests, and many who've been arrested are now being held in these cramped holding cages. And so the proliferation of, COVID-19 is a very serious issue. And I think I love the term marathon. It's like, I feel we're just at the beginning. As I posted today on my Instagram, I said, a charge doesn't equal a conviction. I said, we're just getting started. Like now is the time. I'm not wanting to take away from, I don't know, but just my opinion, I think some of this momentum needs to be transferred or channeled into, flooding, the DA's office, the state attorney general, the governor's office. Because again, it's like, what's the charge? A lot of people have been charged. How many times have we been here before and only to, end up with an acquittal? And so I some of us have to find our way onto that jury. I don't know, but I feel like we're just getting started. And I would hope that with all of this, there's, you know, where there's some unity as to what do we want. It's not just, okay, a conviction. We want equity. You know, we want, you know, improved access to healthcare. We want improved access to credit. You know, improved pathways to home ownership. You know, education. I can't tell you how many kids, minority children, are going to be left behind because they don't have access to the hardware to allow them to engage in distance learning. Like structural racism.
Yes, yes, Christiana.
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to explain to someone how I feel like this is not the protests and the insurrection is with George Floyd is due to George Floyd being a watershed moment. It's not necessarily because of George Floyd specifically. And I think this is also the folly of our system is like you look at the memo that was leaked that gave the DEA carte blanche to investigate any protesters who committed any acts of civil disobedience if it was in relationship to George Floyd. And I immediately told my my partner, oh, well, that's an easy one, because all you have to do is say that the protest isn't about George Floyd. It's about systemic racism. It's about police brutality. It's about the militarization of state violence. It's about all of these things, because it's not just about this one singular moment that people are just popping off. It's about this was the last straw. And so to the Black Lives Matter statement, I think this is what's so difficult and what I have been grappling with, especially like I shared with like sort of getting into an acceptance of mobility, disability, and loss of able-bodiedness, because you know, I within my community has been asked to go down to these protests and to be in this space. And I'm like, well, there's a couple of issues. The first issue is that I walk with a cane. And so, you know, if I am standing for longer than 20 minutes, I will be on the ground. And so unless there is some way for that to not be an issue, then that might be an issue. The second thing is that I have pretty major asthma. I'm on like COPD level inhalers that like, you know, and I'm like, I can't trust that the police are not going to gas us or pepper spray us. And if I'm in that crowd, I'm dead. I will not be able to breathe, literally. And so the way that I've been able to grapple through it is leaning again into sort of the intersections of disability justice and Black liberation, racial justice, and seeing, well, how can I, as Akia and Dr. Boyce were saying, lend the sort of knowledge or wisdom that I have. And one of those things is that I am a nerd. And so I know a lot of things about policy and like where to find information. And so one of the main things I've been doing with the protests here is scanner comms, because I can listen, I know how to listen to police scanners and figure out the codes and find information so that people on the ground can access that information through like a Twitter hashtag and know when the police are planning something violent. And does it feel the same as being out there on the front lines? No, but you know, it's something that helps. And I wrote a post to show people with photos how to do scanner comms on their own. So it's something that anyone can do. And I think it's important because, as they said, you know, there's a part of me, to be completely honest, that's a little bit of a revolutionary. And there's a part of me that's like, well, you know, if I die fighting the good fight, then so be it. But it also, I saw the statement yesterday as well, and it did make me stop and think, because I've had to be talked down by friends and family. Like, I've been ready with my cane and stuff, and they're like, you know, this is not going to work. And so I think that it does help, I think, for folks in this moment who feel like I really, really need to be doing something for this, and that's something, the first thing they think is I need to go down there. There's so many other opportunities to be a part of this moment without putting health and safety in jeopardy. And I think that a lot of, at least for me, grappling through my own personal subjective pain and rage and anger and historical trauma and intergenerational trauma and like all of that stuff. And I think doing this work since I was, a youth activist, and like I've been waiting for this moment for like 15, 20 years, and not being able to be there. I think you can couple that with, well, I think my partner put it best for me. It was like, what, when he saw me doing the scanner comps the first time, he's like, oh, you're like Uhura. And at first I kind of wanted to like slap him because I was like, is this a race thing? But then I was like, because I don't watch Star Trek. But then when he explained it, I was like, oh, okay, that sounds great. And so there's a pride that can be of being the Uhura as opposed to, I don't know, whoever goes through the thingy and goes and fights on the whatever.
ChrisTiana, I'm sorry, but I am revoking your nerd card. If you don't know that Star Trek reference, I want to take a moment and open it up to our listeners, either in our audience live here or on Facebook Live. If you have some questions for Akia, ChrisTiana, or Dr. Boyce, go ahead and pop those in, and we will try to spend some time answering those in our last couple of moments. While they do that, I want to hear from each of you a couple words about what is your brick of choice. I sent a letter out to my community yesterday, and I said, as much as I am a believer of putting your body where your beliefs are, I also believe in long-term, consistent, daily action in the direction of what you believe and the values that you want to embody in this world. And my brick of action is always words and education. Akia, Dr. Boyce, ChrisTiana, what's your brick of choice?
That's the same as yours. My brick of choice has been really on my social media. I've been very, I've been social media protesting, really, because I've been just educating white people in general, I think too. And I also have been talking to Black people and telling them, now is the time for us to strategize and mobilize. And so really just giving them education, giving them resources, helping them to understand that this is going to go, the protests are nice. I appreciate them. I really do. I think that they played a valuable role in our history. But I think that, the protests will simmer eventually. And when they simmer, are we going to still be talking about this when there is no memorial that we just have in our minds fresh? Or, are we going to be talking about these things with our, grandmothers and our aunts and our uncles at Thanksgiving and at Christmas dinners, because to me, that's the stuff, our older, generation, they're not on Instagram. Most of them are on Facebook, but they're watching, Fox News, and they're watching all of these different types of things to get their information. And they also have their ideas. So it's going to be having these really uncomfortable conversations with people that are in your circle and in your sphere of influence. And I think that that is what is going to create lasting change, way beyond the protest.
Thank you. Thank you. ChrisTiana?
This is another word that I'll probably have to explain, but it's the only word I can think to use it, and it's praxis. So for me, my brick of choice is, as an activist and a consultant, I think knowledge sharing and being in community and doing that sort of education is just a natural product of a praxis, which is this sort of like self-reflection and witnessing of what is happening, coming to understanding of those themes, those patterns, those products of it, like the impetus of those things, and then reflecting on what works, what doesn't work, finding finding where your gaps in understanding is, learning that, and then going back around into that circle until you die. And so, people sometimes ask me like, oh, you have so many books. Do you actually read those books? And like, how many of them have you read? And I said, probably between like 60 and 75%. Because each one of these books represents a point in my life, starting from, I guess this book collection started around like 10, 11, when I started using my my allowance to go and buy books. Or, I'm not gonna lie, just check out a book from the school library, and I was a child, I just didn't return it. So I, each one of these each one of these books represents a point in that praxis that I've been of like, what am I missing? What do I need to do to grow? What is this theme that I'm witnessing? And I think the more that I've done that, the more that I've been able in those knowledge share spaces to help folks to strategize and organize. I feel very much like, if I had to give myself I feel very much close to like the Angela Davis type of person, where it's not just academia for me. It's not just reading these things for my own personal knowledge. It's about what exactly is happening in this inequity, and very art of war style. What is the psychological pieces to stop it or disrupt it, dismantle it?
All the above.
Yeah.
Thank you, ChrisTina. Dr. Boyce, just a couple of words we have time for.
Sure. So my bricks of choice have been, advocacy, education, and tactical support. I'm currently providing tactical material support to a group of medics who are working, who are actually protesting, providing, first aid when needed. So helping them with supplies. I've also decided to help by donating to a couple of legal nonprofits, which are helping to provide legal assistance to those who are currently in custody of police as a result of their involvement with the protests.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Boyce, Akia Red, ChrisTina ObeySumner, for spending this time with me and with us and our community. From all of us at the GSBA, a heartfelt thanks to you. If you're listening today and you're wondering how you're going to choose your brick of choice and begin to wield it, you can join us tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. The link should be in the webinar feed or on the Facebook feed. We're having a How to Start Your Anti-Racism Journey town hall, and it's an opportunity to ask some questions, have some difficult conversations, but as ChrisTina said, to learn, to grow, to challenge, and to begin to dismantle. Thank you so much for your time today, and be well.